This scooter is going to save your city. Not alone and not overnight, but this scooter and thousands more like it, and thousands of bikes and e-bikes, and thousands of miles of protected lanes are going to save your city and all our cities from a crisis of our own making. Yeah. So today, 55% of the world's population, that's more than 4 billion people, lives in cities. By 2050, this is going to be over 2/3, and in the US, it's going to be closer to 90%. That means that over the next few decades, cities are going to have to figure out how to house, feed, employ, and move an additional 2.5 billion people. That's billion with a B. And so I want to talk about that last piece, moving people. This is what moving people in cities looks like today. Turns out we're not very good at it, and the challenge is only going to get bigger. And the only way we can meet this challenge is by rethinking how we use our streets. But before we talk about what the streets of tomorrow need to look like in order to meet this challenge, I want to look back and see how the streets that we have today came about and how our conception of streets and public space has evolved over time. You know, in most places, our streets came about quite organically, the result of geology and repeat usage. In New York, for example, Broadway and lots of other lower streets in lower Manhattan came about as a result of Native American walking trails. Those streets are still there today, and they form a sharp contrast with the grid of avenues and streets that we've come to associate with the city. City planners have a term for this phenomenon. They're called desire paths. We're most familiar with them from parks or campuses, and what they reflect is how we want to move rather than how we're told to move. In fact, landscape architects often employ desire paths to design campuses. Instead of trying to guess where students are going to want to walk, they just plant lawns, sit back, and watch where the students wear paths in the grass, and that's where they put the sidewalks. Walt Disney used the same technique in Disneyland. And in cities, these desire paths often determined where our earliest streets, like Broadway, would go and how they would be used. And they're a good analogy for how we viewed streets historically, as flexible, organic places that reflect our priorities. Looking globally across a number of cities, you can see the impact of desire paths in some of our oldest cities, places like Osaka, Tunis, and Rome. And by contrast, you can see the absence of desire paths in our most modern planned cities, especially cities that came about after the advent of the automobile. I'm thinking of Sacramento, Irvine, Dubai. For the longest time, our streets looked like this. They were where all public life and commercial activity happened. Street cart vendors, children playing, streetcars, horse carriages, pedestrians, even scooters. Everything found a place on the street. Until cars came along, and then everything changed. Unlike push carts and scooters and playing children, cars aren't very good at sharing space. So all of a sudden, these activities that used to have a place on the street find themselves incompatible with the increasingly dominant mode of travel, and that had some predictable outcomes. Cars are big, fast, and solid. People are small, slow, and soft. And so, over the first few decades of the 20th century, you see the death rate from auto-related accidents skyrocketing. And although there was an initial backlash against cars, a propaganda campaign led by the auto industry managed to shift the focus away from the cars that were responsible for these deaths to the victims of those crashes. And so as a result, previously acceptable activities like walking and playing in the street get pushed to the side. And this sets up the streets as an exclusive space for the use of cars, and anything and everything else that isn't a car is relegated to the sides. In addition to claiming the entirety of the streets as their domain, cars also took over sidewalks. This is a street corner in New York City in the 1920s, and that same street corner today. All the front steps of the buildings are gone. The windows that used to let light and air into the lower floors are all gone. The sidewalks are about half as wide, and there's 4 times as much space for cars, 2 lanes for driving and 2 lanes for parking. So it's gotten to the point where our streetscapes begin to feel like this, where the vast majority of the space is given over to cars and trucks being parked or driven, and the rest of us, pedestrians, bicyclists, children, scooter riders, we're left to fight over what remains of the sidewalk and the few bike lanes that cities have managed to build. And so whether you like it or not, since about the 1950s, we've been living in a world that's designed around and for cars. Now, cars are good. They're good things. They're good for many things. They can move multiple passengers, they can move luggage, they can go long distances and high speeds, and they're resistant to the elements. In short, they're perfect for family vacations. The problem is they're incredibly inefficient for most urban uses, and most urban uses are solo trips, short distances, and low speeds. In fact, most of the gas you pump into your car is used to power secondary functions, the AC, the heat, the radio, and only 30% goes towards actually moving the vehicle forward. 95% of that is moving the 4,000-pound car forward, and 5% of it is moving you. And so if you put those together, really only 1.5% of the gas you're putting into your tank is to move you around, and the rest is wasted. There has to be a smarter way. Then there's a tremendous inefficiency associated with parking all those cars. So cars sit idle 95% of the time, and yet in US cities, we devote anywhere between 3 and 8 parking spaces for every car. In LA, 183 million square feet, or 14% of the surface area of the city, is devoted to storing cars. Get that, 40% more space is used for storing cars than for driving cars. So all in, all this free parking takes a toll. It amounts to a subsidy to car owners from everyone else to the tune of more than $100 billion every year. Cars are also not that safe if you're not in them. They kill 40,000 Americans every year. That's 3.75 million Americans killed since the start of the automotive age. Let me put it a different way. Cars have killed more than 3 times as many Americans as all our wars since the Revolution. And as people drive more and drive larger vehicles, this is only going to increase. From 2008 to through 2017, we saw a 35% spike in pedestrian deaths. And globally, the story is even more dire. Globally, cars kill 1.3 million people every year, or 1 person every 24 seconds. Since I started talking to you, 20 people have been killed by cars. Add to that the public health impact from car pollution. In cities, 75% of local air pollution is caused by vehicles. So in addition to those 40,000 Americans that are killed in car accidents, there's another 53,000 Americans who die prematurely from the vehicle emissions. These are staggering costs that we've chosen to impose on ourselves. And all this pales in comparison to what's still to come. We also saw the report that the UN Panel on Climate Change put out last year. They found that unless we drastically change our economies, we're going to see wildfires, food shortages, and other catastrophes as soon as 2040. We have to do something. Vehicle emissions in this country are the single leading contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. So if we can solve this piece of the puzzle, we can go a long way towards solving the bigger crisis. There is good news. Almost half the car trips in the US are 3 miles or less. These are eminently walkable, bikeable, scootable trips. In fact, cities have started examining the impact of scooters in their cities. Portland, Oregon surveyed riders, and what they found was 19% of their riders, if they hadn't taken the scooter, would have driven their own car. Another 15% would have taken a rideshare vehicle or a taxi. That's a full third of riders on scooters are replacing car trips. Denver did a similar survey. They found the same, 1/3. We surveyed across Phoenix, LA, Atlanta, Austin, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. So this number keeps emerging from these studies of about 1 in 3 trips, 1 in 3 of those 100 billion trips could be replaced by cleaner modes. That's pretty exciting. And it's especially exciting because cities are starting to do something. So when Paris tried going car-free for a day, they found a 40% reduction in harmful emissions. Brussels' car-free day saw an 80% decline in black carbon. And in London, they saw a 20% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions just when they extended their bike network. So that's a cool thing here. You don't have to replace all those trips. You don't even have to replace a third. If you can replace 1/4 of car trips with scooters or e-bikes, you can reduce vehicle emissions by half. So like I said, this scooter is going to save your city. So what do cities need to do? Cities need to reallocate road space away from inefficient, unsafe, polluting modes of travel, more towards safer, efficient, cleaner modes of travel. Reallocating road space is hard, but it's necessary. Studies have shown that multimodal streets can move almost 3 times as many people as streets devoted solely to cars. And as we've seen time and again, if you build lanes, if you build protected lanes, you increase ridership and you get people out of cars. In Seville, Spain, they added 50 miles of bike lanes, and they now have 70,000 bike trips a day. You know, everyone cites the example of the Netherlands. The Dutch don't bike more than the rest of us because their country is warmer or flatter or morally superior. They do it because they've invested in infrastructure. They've invested in a dense 22,000-mile network of protected bike lanes that amounts to 1/4 of their roads. So the point is, it can be done. We can wean ourselves off of car dependence, but it just takes work. And for a lot of cities, the cities that are grappling with the toughest congestion, they may have to think about pricing their roads more accurately. Congestion pricing. London, Stockholm, Singapore, they're already there. New York, LA, Seattle, Boston, they're considering it now. And the proceeds from these programs would be reinvested into mass transit. And mobility providers like Bird are helping cities as well by sharing data on when and where these trips are happening so that cities have a better idea of how their residents use their streets. So you remember those desire paths. The map on the right shows all the trips to and from Paris's Gare de Lyon train station on Bird scooters. Each of those lines represents a modern-day desire path that the city can look to see where protected bike lanes might be needed, where they might need to widen sidewalks, where they might need to invest in smarter transit. Because the fact of the matter is, the state of our streets is not fixed. They're flexible. And we've seen time and again that when you prioritize streets for people, you get more people out of their cars and using streets. And I think given what we've seen by turning our streets over to cars, and given the 2.5 billion more neighbors we're going to have to accommodate, we have to have the will to rethink how we use our streets. And I believe that the streets of the future are going to look a lot more like the streets of the past. And one day, our children will play in the streets again. Thank you.